Role swapping. If any of you have played a MOBA before, you've probably heard something like this. Play the other roles if you want to improve. Now, this is said commonly enough in other genres, but MOBAs are where you will hear it the most. But we're not here to discuss something like League. Get that thing out of here. We're talking about Overwatch, lads. And despite this being a common thing said in other games, play the other roles to improve, you never hear it that often in Overwatch despite it being a MOBA shooter. The reason you'll hear stuff like this being said is because if you want to gain a better understanding of the game as a whole, then you're going to have to gain a better understanding of the other roles, see how people want to play. And that makes sense, but like I just said, in Overwatch, this is nowhere to be seen. You don't hear this advice anywhere. But despite this, despite people not recommending that you play other roles, it doesn't change the fact that role swapping plays out very similarly to how it does in those other MOBA-like games. And that idea got me thinking, what is the psychology behind role swapping? So to get into it, the idea that actually spawned the main content of this video is that there tends to be two types of players when they're off-rolling. The first is a more team-focused type of player. Someone who will play this off role in a way that they would expect it to be played if they were on their main role. And then you have the more self-focused players. These are the people who, despite being on a completely different role, they will approach the role and play the role as if it were their main. They don't change their playstyle at all. But to get a little bit fancy with it, this is how one of my friends who is an actual psychology student put it. Team-focused, performing the role in a way that aligns with expectations or norms, focusing on how they would want the task to be done if they were in their usual role. You've got self-focused, performing the role as if it was their primary role, applying their own methods and potentially prioritizing their usual standards over the most efficient approach. To provide an example for both if you're still confused, say a support player swapping to tank who ends up having a more defensive style of play as they would want their tank to come back and peel for them if they were on support. That would be a team-focused style. Meanwhile, something like a tank player on DPS like Mei or Reaper who's trying to play on the front lines, focusing more on getting past the enemy tank and disrupting them as if they're a second tank for their own team, would be more self-focused. Or the easier example for self-focused is just a DPS player locking in Roadhog or Yari, but that's too easy to point out here, lads. So you can pick away yourselves at which one you are in the comments. I mean, unless I'm fecking around, then I'm typically more of a team-focused player, but that's besides the point right now, and we can discuss that later. It's time for the psychology. And in social psychology, there's 5 concepts when it comes to team environments, organizational environments, anything of that sort, that affect our behavior. However, only 4 of them are important at the moment, and they are as follows. Role expectations. These are the beliefs about how a person should behave in a given role. A team focus reflects an adherence to role expectations, ensuring that the task is done in a way that meets collective standards. Say a support player expecting a tank to take space and peel, who ends up playing more defensive like a diva, like I mentioned earlier. Second, role conformity. This involves adhering to the expected behaviors and norms associated with a specific role within a group or organization. A team focus aligns with this concept since it's about meeting standards. Both this and expectations are fairly similar in how they operate, focusing on how you or others think the role should be performed. Third, role adaptation. This refers to how an individual can adjust their behavior when taking on a new or different role. A self-focus can be seen as a form of role adaptation, since the person applies their own style and standards to the new task. Think a DPS just going on a murder spree rampage as Hog, Kiri, Bap, but a team focus can also involve it, just to a bit of a lesser extent. Something like an Ana player swapping a hit scan, since it's just Ana again without needing to worry about healing your team. And finally, role overlap. This occurs when the responsibilities and behaviors of different roles in the team start to blend. A self-focus can involve role overlap, where the usual person role influences how they perform the new task. For example, a support player on Sombra focusing on hacking health packs or disrupting enemies rather than doing damage. So as you can see, we've got about 2 for each, though expectations and conformity are so similar that it's nearly one elongated point. But the one that I personally found very interesting when I was looking at this the first time was role overlap. And that's because this is how most people will learn a new role whenever they're trying to get better at the game. And that's because role overlap is how people will go about learning a new role. A hit scan is going to be more likely to enjoy something like Ana or a Yari if they want to try support. A tank is going to enjoy characters like Mei or Brig. A Lucio player would like more of a faster paced character, think someone like Venture, Tracer, Wrecking Ball. And as for flex DPS players, Look, there's no logic when it comes to our role to begin with, lads. It does sound obvious when it's said out loud, but I find it cool how we all start with that self-focused style whenever we're trying to learn something new. We only have a knowledge base of one specific role, so of course we're going to use that knowledge to apply it to our new one. It's only until after you have a better understanding of the roles and the game as a whole that you actually begin to have a bit more of your own choice in how you play these new roles. You might stick to expectations, you might go with how you expect the role to be played, or you'll just play how you want to play regardless of how your team would feel. And with our groundwork laid for how people will play roles differently, let's take a bit more of a dive into why. And for this, I'm going to take a look at this paper because I actually found that it had quite a lot for us to take a look at. It explains it beautifully, but I need to quote this properly, so I'm going to have to pull out my laptop. 4 motive patterns are proposed as characteristics of organizations and as capable of producing the required behaviors in varying degrees. These are legal compliance, instrumental satisfaction, self-expression, and the internalization of organizational goals. Now, legal compliance is not important here, so we can skip over it for the moment. But the other 3 are perfect for what we're talking about. So first, let's look at instrumental satisfaction. In real life, it gives rewards for a job done properly. But in our case, a reward is closer to stuff like teammate satisfaction, acting out a win condition of your team comp, and of course, winning the game. It's a very team-focused motive, but obviously there's a self-focused element to it as well. Everyone wants to win the game after all. But I'd simply argue it's more focused on others, having a hefty aspect of role expectation involved within it. As for self-expression, in a more game sense, it's skill expression. Stuff like how DPS players gravitate towards those more aggressive supports. Ana, Kiriko, you get me. Since to them, double tapping an enemy Widow is going to be a lot more rewarding than holding down right click on your Mauga. The same applies on tank as well. Most DPS prefer a more off-tank style, characters like Hog or Zarya who do strong damage, while supports tend to end up preferring more protective type of tanks. You can think stuff like the old Orisa, D.Va, etc. While again, it's a mix of both of our concepts, this one heavily leans on more of a self-focused style. I mean, it's called self-expression. And finally, the internalization of organizational goals. This is when people take on the goals of the organization, or team in this case, which would be things like winning the game, acting on your job in the team comp, and combining them with their belief on how to achieve them. Both styles use this, whether you want to play how you wish that role to be played, or straight up play how you want to, regardless of whatever everyone else thinks. Obviously, with all these motives, you can't label one as strictly orientated towards one playstyle or the other. Some of them certainly lead towards one more than they lean towards the other, but it's not black and white. You can still go for more self-expressive and skill-expressive plays while still playing for your team. It's obviously not like you're locked into one or the other, regardless of how you think something should be played. But depending on the person, one or more of these is why you gravitate towards this, that, or the other whenever you're playing any character in any role that's not your main. Now earlier on, I mentioned how I had 5 concepts, but how one wasn't important at that moment. So that 5th concept was role conflict. It's a common issue when individuals occupy multiple roles with competing demands or expectations. It can lead to inefficiency as the approach required for one role may conflict with the needs of another. But the reason I didn't cover it earlier is because it needs a bit of a deeper dive than that, so we're returning to Kahn's paper. 4 basic categories of role conflicts are considered. Incompatible expectations held by a given member of a role set, intra-center conflict. Incompatible expectations held by 2 or more members, inter-center conflict. Incompatibilities between 2 or more roles held by the same focal person, inter-role conflict. And incompatibilities between the requirements of a role and the needs or values of the person holding it, person-role conflict. And I want to focus in on those last 2 in particular, person-role and inter-role conflict, as they directly correlate with our 2 styles of off-rolling. Starting with inter-role, the incompatibilities in this case would be something like how a DPS is meant to do damage while the support is typically meant to protect the team, which ends up with this player taking to role expectation and conformity, or our team-focused style. Meanwhile, person-role conflict leans a lot more into our self-focus, with the player switching roles and wanting to do something that wouldn't be typical for said role. We can use the classic example of a DPS on tank who just wants to do DPS things, so the odds of them playing like a dumbass are high. At first, I wasn't planning on covering role conflict since it had less of an impact to me at first in comparison to the other 4, but it's actually the most insightful of the bunch. And there's one more thing I want to mention in regards to how players come about these styles of play, and it's coming from a different paper this time. When individuals experience power working in organizations, behaviors such as self-assertion, creativity, and risk-taking change. As the self-serving goal of the individual increase, the needs of others and the organization diminish. The individual becomes rude and may undertake unethical behavior. Now, I mean, if that's not Hit Sky DPS players in a nutshell, I don't know what is. Jokes aside, when a player has a taste of what they can consider success from their main role, it can end up bleeding into the other roles. Like I have already said multiple times during this. Think your DPS mains flanking on Kiriko, your supports only hacking health packs instead of shooting the enemy as Sombra, or tank players just thinking they could 1v1 a Rhine when they're playing Brig. Obviously, this is our self-focused style, no matter what way you look at it, but it's interesting about how experiencing success, power, kills, whatever way you want to look at it, in one role can bring players towards trying the exact same thing even if they're in a different one. And it will even happen if it's not the most efficient method whatsoever. So to finish us off, you've got two types of role swaps. Some focus on what they would want if they were on their main role, while others don't care and just play however they want to play. And then, because of all that, we have so much text that I had to read through so I could get somewhat of a script written about it. Though it doesn't change the fact that some of this just gets entirely thrown out the goddamn window, considering some players just want to play a character if they think the character looks pretty. And I mean, you know what? You have to respect it to a certain extent. So whether you're role conforming, role adapting, or not even role swapping to begin with, I really hope that you enjoyed this. And that's the psychology behind a player's decisions when they're not on their main role. Obviously, some of these warrant a bit of a no shit Sherlock response. I mean, yeah, of course they do. That is what psychology is half the time when you realistically read it. But it doesn't change the fact that this was really interesting to me, was fun to research, and was a bit of a change of pace to how my videos have been going over the last while. There's also high odds that I might have misunderstood something from one of the papers, so if you want to give them a read and correct me, and be nice about it preferably, well look, it's in the description so you know where to go. And speaking of the description, for a bit of self-promotion, I've got a Discord, Twitch, Twitter, all down below as well, so if you want to check out any of them, you know where to go. But for now, go on, if you're still here, drop a comment, drop a like, a sub, all that YouTube stuff, and I'll talk to you next time, lads.